All right, so the apparent end of at least this phase of the war in Afghanistan, I think, is a good opportunity for people who are interested to really learn about it. Now, I can understand the impulse to say, well, it's over, why do we need to know? I spent a lot of time reading about it because I wanted it to end, and fair to ask, now that it's over, why would you want to read about it? But we read about World War II and World War I and the Civil War, and at some level, I suppose we read books because we find them interesting or entertaining, or they can provide a lot of narrative, which is definitely true with a lot of stuff. But the reason is we want to learn lessons about this conflict and how completely stupid it was. There were people at the time who said we never should have gone, and since then there have been many people who have said, even if they were wrong about us going, that we should just leave. I just watched today a speech that Ron Paul gave exactly 11 years ago where he said if we don't leave now, we'll end up being there for a decade. Prescient as always, it seems. So I think it's important for people to understand how incredibly stupid this war was, especially from the perspective of people who knew that it was stupid and said so in writing long before this happened. This was completely 100% a waste of life and money and time and resources. There was a redistribution that happened, right? There were contractors who made a lot of money. There are politicians who advanced their careers through this war to greater or lesser degrees. But on net, it was a catastrophe for Americans. It was a bigger relative catastrophe for people in Afghanistan and for the world in general. So I would say that it is definitely a topic that if you haven't read about, you definitely should. So I'm going to do a short video here, just going to go over some excellent books to kind of help you get a grasp of the conflict now that it's over, and you can pair this with, your own personal reminiscences. If you're old like me, you remember when the war started. If you're under 20, you obviously don't remember when the war started because it will have been 20 years in a month. So let's go ahead and give some good book recommendations. These are books that I probably have recommended at one time or another in the past, but this is just going to be like a collection of all of them. So first on the list is Devil's Game, How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam by Robert Dreyfuss. And Robert Dreyfuss is no libertarian. He's a left-wing guy. It's pretty clear in this because he, one of the ways he shows how evil Islam is to show how capitalist it is. But this book is kind of flies in the face of the idea of a civilizational conflict. And I'm not totally opposed to that idea, by the way, but it seems very clear that throughout the 20th century, both the United States and the British were very comfortable helping fundamentalist Muslims in their geopolitical chess game, usually against the communists, but also against, especially the Soviet Union, but also against Arab nationalism, whether it be Nasser or Sadat or whoever else. The British and then the Americans have been subsidizing, encouraging, and siding with fundamentalist Islam all across the Middle East for basically the entire 20th century. And that's very important in the context of the war in Afghanistan because we are sometimes led to believe that, the Taliban's this horrible reactionary conservative Islamic force. It's lumped together with all radical Islam, including things like Wahhabis and Shia, even though it's distinct from all of those things, which is something most people don't understand. And so understanding that history is really important. Right? It gives context. So next is Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and Bin Laden from the Soviet Invasion to September 10th, 2001 by Steve Cole. New York Times bestseller. Again, this is not some libertarian author. This is very mainstream, but it just chronicles the history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and some of the prehistory to that, the series of governments that existed in Afghanistan before that. And again, showing that the CIA was actively working with the Saudis and the ISI to support, subsidize, train radical Islamic elements, including specifically Osama bin Laden in a few cases. This is something that is often alleged, kind of taken for granted, but also just kind of ignored by a huge part of the society that doesn't fit into their narrative of reality, and so they don't want to integrate that information into their worldview. That's a very good book, by the way. Very, very readable. Devil's Game is interesting, but there's not really a narrative. This definitely does have a narrative. So it's a real page turner. I think I probably read it about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago at this point. Excellent book, who the characters were, and also going into the Clinton administration and how they supported the Taliban, right? We talk about, there's been this great conflation of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and they are not the same thing. And we were perfectly happy, at least as a government, to work with the Taliban throughout much of the 90s, and they actually helped the Taliban to some extent, again with Pakistan, to bring them to power in the first place to a large extent. So again, that's very important to realize. We helped the Taliban before. We fought a 20-year war trying to remove them and actually focusing on removing them and not on catching bin Laden. And now 20 years later, they are back in power and potentially more firmly established than they were previously, with a lot more legitimacy now, right? It wasn't the Taliban that defeated the Soviets, but now the Taliban has, quote unquote, defeated the Americans. So, if that doesn't give you legitimacy in the eyes of the world, I don't know what was, right? You have the world superpower. You defeated them, however you want to characterize the defeat, how they did it, guerrilla actions. There were no big spectacular battles. They didn't need to be. They still won. So congratulations, U.S. government. You have, as you tend to always do, make your supposed enemies stronger, just like you did with Iran when you overthrew their biggest rival, Saddam Hussein, just like you did supporting Al-Qaeda in eastern Syria and western Iraq, creating a caliphate, just like you did in Yemen, just like you've done time and time and time and time and time and time and time again with trillions of our dollars and, thousands of bodies worth of blood, tens or hundreds of thousands of broken bodies worth of damage. And it's absolutely atrocious. Like, if you get in a car accident and you kill someone, right, you're in trouble and you should pay for that. But what they have done, and there's a whole bunch of them involved, politicians, generals, lobbyists, journalists, who contributed some share of that. And, the amount of guilt is enormous. So, the number of these people that should be punished, none of them will ever be punished at all, right? They won't even lose status, sadly, but they all should. It's been a parade of tragedies and incompetence. And it's funny too, because it's coming from people who allege themselves to be super smart and super capable and the best and the brightest, the eggheads, blah, 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 and no. So further along those lines, a book you should definitely read is Taliban by Ahmed Rashid, another New York Times bestseller. So again, I'm not drawing from a particular ideological thread here. This is the history of the Taliban, where they began, when, how they grew, how they came to power, why they stayed in power, and the details of their negotiations and machinations with the Clinton administration, with the Saudis, with Osama bin Laden, and with the Pakistan. Absolutely necessary to read. It's been on my shelf a long time. I got around to reading it, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and gives you all the details, the specifics about, like one thing I learned from that is their particular brand of Islam, which is not Wahhabism, it's not Shiitism, it's called Deobandism. It comes from Deoband, which is a city in India. India is a Hindu country, but it actually has the second highest number of Muslims of any country in the world. Its population is so huge. So there's a lot of Islamic history there, and the type of Islam that the Taliban espouses or uses is Deobandism, which means they're not ideologically the same as Osama bin Laden or the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or the Qataris, right? They're very distinct. And then they have, on top of that, a host of very important cultural differences. So understanding that is important. You don't want to conflate them all together, which is all too often what people do. So understanding their history is really important. But if you want to understand the Taliban, you also want to understand Al-Qaeda. So to that point, the perfect soldiers. And you look there, that's Mohammed Atta with a 1,000-yard stare there. And of course, Mohammed Atta is not from Afghanistan. None of the 19 hijackers are from Afghanistan. They're from Saudi Arabia. They're from Kuwait. I think maybe 1 or 2 are from Egypt. Al-Qaeda is an Egyptian, Saudi Arabian affair with a lot of people from the Gulf states and then occasionally from other people, but ironically never Afghanistan. It was never an Afghani operation. They're not from Afghanistan. They don't have the same ideology as Afghans. And another important point of this book, and some of the others that I will detail in a moment, is that yes, Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan, but much of the planning, much of the recruiting, much of the fundraising, much of the organization that went into the 9/11 attacks didn't happen in Afghanistan. It happened in places like Hamburg, Germany, Madrid, Spain, New Jersey, Georgia, Florida, Maine, Boston, right? It happened all over the place. So this idea that because they were in Afghanistan, that makes Afghanistan for a target. We might as well reinvade Germany, Spain, and start drone striking Florida, where they were learning how to fly. Like, they didn't learn how to fly in Jalalabad, at the Jalalabad flight school. They learned in Florida, Venice, Florida, actually. Which brings me to this, another very good book, very famous book, well-known national bestseller, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11 by Lawrence Wright. I feel like people make a mistake with big events like 9/11, especially if you live through it, of assuming that, you watch the news, you know what happened. But until you actually take the time to read, you don't know what happened, and the details are important. And people talk about the Taliban's culpability here. The Taliban is guilty of a lot of things. They didn't really help Al-Qaeda all that much. And if they helped Al-Qaeda, well, so did the Germans, so did the Spanish, so did the Americans, right? They all were here illegally. A lot of people on the right wing talk about the open border on the south and how Al-Qaeda and Taliban can come up through that border. Well, hypothetically, I guess that could happen, but the 9/11 hijackers didn't do that at all. They came in through airports, and they had passports, and they had visas, and they were here legally. The State Department let them in, right? And if somebody's going to be guilty, whoever issued them a green card is pretty guilty. If you go and look at documentaries on 9/11, there is a woman in the airport in Portland. Several of the hijacking teams, not all three of them, but not all four of them, but I think three of them took flights from Portland, Maine, and then got a connection at Logan International Airport in Boston, and then from there is where they hijacked the planes that they then crashed. And you can see interviews of this woman who worked at the airport in Portland, and she talks about, who knows what she really felt at the time. When she relates it now, she says that she was suspicious and she had a bad feeling about them. Okay, but she still let them have the tickets and let them through. She didn't blow any whistles or alarms, and she didn't stop anyone. So we should hellfire missile her to death, right? We should kill her. We should invade her town and slaughter everyone there and blow up every Wendy for 20 years, right? But the thing is, the people in Afghanistan, if anything, perhaps with zero exceptions, or maybe one or two, we can get real technical on it, but the unbelievably huge majority of them are less culpable than she would be, right? None of them let them on a plane. None of them issued them a green card. None of them taught them how to fly. None of them did anything to motivate them, right? Never mind that. That's a whole other topic. Why were they motivated? Read Perfect Soldiers and Looming Tower both talk about that. So the logic here is just ridiculous. And again, we wouldn't do it to Germany. We wouldn't do it to Spain. We wouldn't do it to Venice, Florida, where a lot of these guys learned how to fly. There's a good documentary, if you can find it, called The Venice Flying Circus, all about that. But it's in the Looming Tower as well. So there's this idea called the safe haven, and it should be referred to as the safe haven myth. The idea that if they're in Afghanistan, that somehow gives them a springboard to terrorist attacks, anywhere in the world. But that's false. Being in Afghanistan does not put you closer to an airport in the United States. And what's interesting now is we have Al-Qaeda units. We have terrorist units right now in other parts of the country that we're subsidizing, in Yemen, in Syria, previously in Iraq, that we're subsidizing Al-Qaeda in those countries. We're protecting them. So safe haven gives us license to invade Afghanistan, but safe haven is not a problem when they're practically in the Mediterranean Sea in northeast or northwest Syria, right on the Turkish border, or if they're in Yemen, right by the Strait of right by the opening of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, right? That's somehow Afghanistan's worse, right? So people say this, but the fact that they were there, some of them were there, didn't help them at all. Like most of the planning didn't even happen there. Most of the fundraising didn't happen there. Most of the people didn't come from there. None of them came from Afghanistan. So again, very, very important. And then the last, well, I don't have this book with me because I listened to it on audiobook, but I will highly, highly recommend the book, The Enemy We Created, The Myth of the Taliban Al-Qaeda Merger in Afghanistan. This is by Alex Strick, S-T-R-I-C-K, Van Linschoten, Linschoten. It's got a couple other authors, but just search for that. An Enemy We Created, The Myth of the Taliban Al-Qaeda Merger in Afghanistan. I listened to this book again when I was in Montana 2 years ago. And this goes into the entire focus is on the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And they didn't have an alliance. Sorry. I still have not learned how to manage this thing. But it's terrible. I'm sorry. Mullah Omar described bin Laden as a chicken bone stuck in his throat. He had offered him sanctuary there as a Muslim. He was looking for status as a Muslim. There was a whole attempt of him to give himself different Muslim titles, Mullah, a few others. I can't remember what they all were. And of course, this was debated in other Islamic societies, the Ummah and some of these more established, more authoritative Islamic societies were saying, well, no, you don't actually have that kind of rank. And bin Laden was seen as, someone who had done jihad, who was somebody who had some status and some standing. And so he was he was allowed to stay there. But they were irritated by his activities. They forbade him to engage in terrorism. He denied it. But they had invited him in. There's this whole Pashtun idea of guest rights. So they had this awkward, we don't like him here, but we don't want to kick him out because we'll lose face, and he is a guest. And then when it came to the war, and I actually remember watching this on television at the time, the Taliban was very insular and they didn't have many outlets. I believe they had one foreign embassy in Pakistan. And so if you wanted to get a statement from the Taliban, you had to go to Islamabad and they would give a statement there. And, the Bush administration started making all these demands, and they said, we will hand him over to a third party, to a Muslim nation, if you provide any evidence of his guilt. Now, that's not exactly unreasonable to ask for evidence, right? You're going to invade our country, maybe have some evidence, not just go on your say-so. So the Bush administration provided none. They laughed at it. I think a lot of Americans just laughed, like, why should we have to show evidence? Well, yeah, if you're going to invade a country, that's not really even enough, but that's what they asked. And as it became clear that the Americans were still going to attack, they lowered their threshold. So, okay, we don't even need evidence. We'll extradite him to any Muslim country. So again, that could have been Egypt, that could have been Syria, that could have been Morocco, that could have been Malaysia, that could have been Indonesia, that could have been any number one of these very friendly states where it would have been they land on the tarmac and they turn around and don't even get out of the plane, and then they get extradited to the United States. Done deal, right? No reason. Or tortured and put to death in a lot of these countries. Like, do you think Hosni Mubarak would treat Osama bin Laden well? Absolutely not. Even Saudi Arabia, he would have been probably executed. So they didn't accept this, and then as the bomb started to drop, they said, we'll deport him to any third country. Doesn't have to be Muslim. So Canada, Italy, the UK, Germany, Russia, Mexico, anywhere. Nauru, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and nope, absolutely not. And we're going to regime change. And the forces, and this is detailed in several of the books, they were detailed to fight the Taliban not Al-Qaeda to any significant extent. In fact, it seems very likely, and I'll get to this in the next two books, that there seemed to have been a strategy for helping or hoping that Al-Qaeda would escape, at least Osama bin Laden, because he proved to be very useful alive than did dead. So, of course, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism by Scott Horton. So this one is obviously a libertarian, but he knows his stuff. The citations in this are excellent. He doesn't make any claims that he can't back up. He's heard it from the primary sources. He cites it to the primary sources. His knowledge on the topic is exceptional. And this is about the war on terror generally, and I could not find my copy, although I know I have it somewhere, of his book on Afghanistan, Fool's Errand. Highly, highly recommend those. There's he goes into much more detail about the idea and the information and the evidence that the Bush administration purposely let Osama bin Laden escape. That the CIA and the military on the ground were dead set against what they wanted to capture him. They wanted to kill him. They wanted revenge for 9/11, understandably so. And they were muzzled and they were restrained and they were redirected to fight the Taliban, who are now back in control completely, with a big feather in their cap and a whole bunch of weapons that we were probably better armed than they've ever been ever. They have an air force now. We basically gave them an air force and an artillery and tanks and armored vehicles and everything else that the American taxpayers can create in 20 years of excess and subsidy. So, those books, I think all of them are worth reading. All of them are good page turners. None of them are real grinds. And, there's more. I would recommend, if you want to know more, if Scott Horton's books both have lots of references and great bibliography, so you can look for other texts about the actual, the specifics of the surge, the specifics of various strategies that, bureaucratic generals came up with to justify their promotion and to elevate themselves in the mind of the media by saying, well, I was successful in Afghanistan because of a metric that I invented that I said that we met. How do all those people look now? How does General McChrystal look now? They were all completely wrong about everything. Everything. The highest authorities in our society, right? The most power, the most wealth, the most prestige, all completely wrong. And no accountability for any of it. So I think it's very important that people know this and they explain it to people whenever they can. I think that people's impulses here are very true. I think most people are looking at it like, wow, that was a fucking waste. What the hell? The whole thing was just completely... I've heard that spoken of repeatedly. Of course, you still have the people out there who are in complete denial and delusion saying, if only we had stayed longer, this wouldn't have happened. The way to win, the only way we could have won would have been to impose, to exact a cost that nobody, I think, would be willing to pay. Yeah, we could kill all the Afghans. We could nuke them or use chemical weapons. We could create camps and lock them all up and exterminate them or whatever, or import millions of Americans and create a colony there, right? Those things might have done it. There might have been hope then. But there's, that I'm not advocating that we have done those things. Those would have been horrible things to do. And so what? We're not willing to pay the price to win. So why the fuck are we there? And what even was the point of winning? Like, what was so great about, and it's not like the Taliban's going to become a puppet of India or a puppet of China, for Christ's sakes. You think that the Taliban likes what the Chinese are doing to Uyghurs? If you don't like what the Chinese are doing to Uyghurs, how do you think the Taliban feels about it? Think they're happy about it? One of the reasons Osama bin Laden went to war against the United States was because of the treatment of Muslims in China, which rather erroneously in that case he blamed on the United States. But no. And if we couldn't conquer Afghanistan, what makes you think the Chinese can? Right? You really think? And you don't think we wouldn't help? You don't think that would have been the Soviet Union all over again times 10? Fuck yeah. So it's fun to learn history. I recommend people read about the Civil War and World War I and World War II and the Revolution and all the stuff in between, the antebellum period and all that. This is history that's just been made. It's being made. And it's very important that we get it right, that we understand what really happened, what went wrong, and why the whole thing was just a huge mess. We never should have gone, ever, Ron Paul issued a bill of mark and reprisal. Okay, these horrible criminals did this. We'll put out $1 billion bounty on each one of them. We'll say anyone who goes after them, they could have given other incentives. You're tax exempt, blah, blah, blah. If a corporation catches them, they don't have to pay taxes for 20 years, whatever. There would have been plenty of reasons. And nope. We went to a regime change to try and build. Well, I don't know what they were thinking they were going to build. A progressive Yankee-style town council democracy based out of Kabul. The fuck? Are these people supposed to be smart? Did they all go to Harvard? Probably. So don't go to Harvard. Read these books instead. But thanks all for watching and have a great day. Goodbye.